Hi, welcome to this lecture on the educational design for complex learning tasks. In this lecture I will introduce the 10 steps to complex learning design approach to you. This is the second lecture out of 5. The first one was presented by my colleague Dr. Bert Sloff, and my name is Kasper Hulshoff. I'm a teacher at the Department of Education. In this lecture I will look at some of the steps in the 10 steps model, but basically I'll focus on the core concepts of the model, which are 4 components. Now if you look at the figure in this, on this slide, you can see that it looks quite complex, and I'll walk you through the model. So what are the 10 steps model's core concepts? Well, basically the core concept of the model is a learning task, and it's represented by a circle in the model. So you can see the whole learning environment or the whole learning experience for a learner can be made up by many different learning tasks, all represented here by different circles. The main concept of these learning tasks, which are followed in sequence, is that they vary. So the learner has variability of practice, which means that each learning task is as different as possible from the previous one. And in the model this is represented by the triangles within the circles, which vary in position, which means that each learning task is different from the one before. But still they can be a bit similar, so they are grouped by similarity, and those form task classes. But we'll come to that. Because it's impossible for a learner who begins with a new learning task to understand completely what they are going to accomplish, you need to support that learner. And you can do so by 2 different means. One is by supporting them, and one is by guiding them through the learning task. And I will talk about that in my next video, what the difference between support and guidance means. In the model this is represented by, well, in a sense, the level of water within each circle, which represents the level of support and guidance given to a learner. Usually the first learning task within a task class starts with maximum support, which gradually fades over time through the different learning tasks. So the level of the water within the circles decreases over the different learning tasks. I already mentioned the task classes, which is a representation of a group of different learning tasks of a similar complexity. So each learning task has a similar complexity to a learner, and when they have the same focus, or they can be grouped together, they can form a task class. And the whole learning experience is composed of going through different task classes, where you can say to a learner, when you're ready to go to the next task class, well, then you may proceed, one might say. Within a task class, the support starts at maximum and gradually decreases, and usually the last learning task within a task class has no support. So the learner needs to show that their performance is up to par, which means that they can accomplish the task within that task class, which you might call the learning goal, although within the model it's called the performance objective. When they can show that they perform at a sufficient level, they can proceed to the next task class until they finish their last task class, after which learning is finished, and they should have reached, the learner should have reached the performance objective that you had in mind before you started your design. Now, the 10 steps model is based on the so-called 4CID model by Jeroen van Merrienboer. And the 4CID, this means 4 components of instructional design. What are these 4 components? Well, Jeroen van Merrienboer introduced them, and there are firstly learning tasks, which I just talked about. And their most important characteristic is that they offer the learner a whole task experience. So not a part of the whole task, but a whole task indeed. And these task experiences are based on real life tasks and situations, and they integrate knowledge, skills and attitudes. So it's not learning from a book in a sense. It's experiencing the actual task that you're designing your learning environment for. Now this is very important, very difficult for a learner, so you need to support the learner by doing that learning task. And you can do this in two ways. You can do this by giving the learner supportive information, and this is information that is helpful for learning and performing everything that involves problem solving during learning, or reasoning or decision making. So the learner needs to have information on how to accomplish the task that you want them to accomplish. And we call this supportive information. And the 10 steps model, or the 4CID model, makes a difference between that kind of supportive information and information that helps a learner in performing routine aspects of a learning task. They call that procedural information. And that's the kind of information that a learner needs to perform any aspect of the learning task that comes up every now and again in the real life setting. So pressing the correct button, for example, on a screen. And the reason they make a distinction between these two, supportive information and procedural information, is because the way of learning from both is different, is considered to be different. So you need to make a different design for incorporating supportive information or procedural information. Now the final component, the fourth component in the 4CRD model, is so-called part task practice. One assumption of the model is that in some cases some routine aspects of a learning task need to be motorized or automated, you might say. And this involves really heavy training in a sense. And this goes against some of the assumptions of the model itself, which says you need to have variability of practice, for example. In some cases you really need actual drill and practice study, you might say. So practice items provided to help learners reach a very high level of automaticity. And one challenge of incorporating part task practice, well, that's part of the reason it needs a separate component, because it's pretty hard to incorporate that within the 10 steps model. A final so-called component or aspect of the 10 steps model is so-called second order scaffolding, which is the kind of support that you give to learners when you want to help them in their actual learning process itself. So going through learning tasks and judging when you can go to a next task class, for example, is something you can leave to learners themselves, or what next learning task to select from a stack of learning tasks. That's something you can ask learners to do for themselves, but it's also something you can help them with. And this is called second order scaffolding. And that kind of scaffolding is built the same way regular scaffolding is done. So it means that you start out with maximum support, and this gradually fades over time, after which there is no second order scaffolding at all anymore. So if you look at the different components in sequence, you can see, to start with the learning tasks, those are the circles within the 10 steps model, or the visualization of the model. Well, you can see they integrate skills, knowledge and attitudes. So it's not just a matter of knowledge, not just a matter of skill learning, and also not just a matter of having the correct attitude while learning. Another aspect is that they vary over time. Each learning task is as different from the previous one as possible. And in practice, this all, of course, means that learning is pretty hard for a learner, because they can't rely on their previous, well, on habit, you might say. So you try to take them out of their comfort zone and make learning a bit harder for them, because the assumption is that this also maximizes the gain in learning, because they need to be on their toes while they're learning. This is not the most efficient way of learning, maybe, but it's a choice, because this solves, as the model says, this solves the transfer paradox. So, okay, it's not the most efficient way of learning, but it's also the most, it's a more effective way of learning. There's a simple to complex sequencing involved here, where the learning starts out simple for the learner because their prior knowledge is lacking at the time. And when they go to a new task class, they have more prior knowledge, so they're able to do the learning task in a more complex environment. But for the learner, it's not more complex because they have more prior knowledge and more skills built up. So the sequencing of learning tasks or of task classes is from simple to complex, but for the learner, it's on the same level of complexity all the time. How do you accomplish this? By supporting them and guiding them through the learning tasks and over task classes. And every new task class starts with maximum support, which gradually fades over the learning tasks, and in the new task class it starts again with maximum support. And we call this a scaffolding sequence or a sawtooth pattern. We'll come to that in the next lecture. So, supportive information means that you try to help the learner accomplish their goals for the learning tasks. So, for non-recurrent task aspects, you try to help them. And this means that you have to know what kind of knowledge, prior knowledge, learners already have before you start designing your supportive information. And this involves getting some idea about their mental model, or about the cognitive strategies that they follow while they're solving a learning problem, and the kind of feedback that you can use to help guide them through the learning process to help them accomplish a successful learning goal. For procedural information, it's a bit different. This is about recurrent task aspects, so it's about aspects where you use the same knowledge in many different tasks. And this means that you give them how-to instructions on how to accomplish a certain goal within a learning task. So whenever you notice that they have to press the correct button or type in a correct sequence while programming a computer, for example, they need to end a line with a semicolon, then you can give corrective feedback as soon as you notice, or as the system notices, that the learner forgets to do so. So one aspect of procedural information is that the guidance is given just in time, on a just-in-time basis. So not available beforehand, but only available when the learner needs it, not when the learner does not need it. Finally, par-task practice is incorporated in the model, well, over learning tasks and also over different task classes. It's something you select for recurrent task aspects that you really need to have automated in a learner. So this may be something that a learner really needs to accomplish successfully all the time. And here it's allowed to have repetition, and it can be in a sense a boring task. So the model says don't do this all in one at a time or all the time, but interleave it with the learning tasks that are part of your original design. And this is difficult, and basically the model says try to avoid it when you can, but sometimes you just can't avoid this. So that's the reason it's step 10 in the model, I believe. So those are the 4 components in the 4CRD model that make up the 10 steps model. And in my next lecture I will talk about the 10 steps and how they are created out of these 4 components for instructional design. So that's it for now. Thank you for your attention. Bye bye.